want to try and inspire some hope and some optimism in those of you who are married this morning. Not that you're being married, but you already are married. Because sometimes you need some hope and some optimism in that particular realm of life. And I think if you have been bound by God to another human being, you're trying to fulfill a certain purpose, I would hope. Maybe you're not. Maybe that's why you are having a lot of problems in your marriage. I'll try to focus your mind today in some basically, hopefully, positive scriptures. I think some of them are very, very exciting, in fact, about the kind of marriage you ought to have, because some of you don't know what kind of marriage you ought to have, and the way to get it. Because you see, in the worldwide Church of God, unlike people in the world, we have the potential and the knowledge and the background and the revelation and the spiritual, supernatural resources needed to build a kind of a marriage that is very rare. I doubt that anybody in your block has the potential of having this kind of marriage. We can build the kind of marriage that is unique. It is 1 in a million. Maybe that's a little high, maybe 1 in 500,000. And you can have it, and nobody else can that is not a member of the worldwide Church of God. And it's a pretty exciting thing. If you don't know it, if you haven't understood it, it's time to begin to sort of check into what God says about marriage. Now, some of us have been bamboozled, maybe during the liberal era and some of the de-emphasis on the way of God and the laws of God and the power of God and the Spirit of God. And we get bamboozled into thinking certain things, and some have sort of assumed that our marriages are on the same plane, the same level as anybody else's. And when we have problems for the same reason anybody else has problems. So we've gone to marriage counselors, some of us, and we've read all the books written by the secular people. Because we think, wrongfully, that our structure, our marriage, is like everybody else's. We don't know there's something there they don't have. We assume that when we have a bad marriage, well, you ought to discard it. When we have a marriage in the Church of God that is so-so, you tolerate it, you put up with it, what can you do? I mean, you're not compatible, sad, so you live with it. And you don't realize you don't have to live with it. You can do something about it. And then, of course, we even have brethren who talk about the good marriages they see in the Church of God. And they give themselves the glory. And they say, well, I got a good marriage, but, happenstance, I had a lot of luck. Had a lot of luck. And that, to me, is tantamount to the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, because you have taken a work of the Spirit of God and you have in effect rejected that work, because there is a work in marriages that the Spirit of God does. I want to stress today that the key to our kind of marriage, God's type of marriage, is what He calls sanctification of that marriage. God will sanctify a marriage if you want Him to and you do certain things. He won't if you don't, but He will if you do. And that means asking God to elevate your marriage onto a spiritual plane. Onto a spirit plane, or I should say a spiritual plane, and asking God to use it and to work through it and to bless it and to transform you and your mate into vessels that have been energized and empowered and renewed by the Spirit of God. When you and your wife or you and your husband have been renewed by the Spirit of God, that will then create a union, brethren, a kind of a marriage, a unit and an entity that will be dynamic. It will not be perfect, but it will be dynamic, it will be growing, it will be filled with blessings. There will be no curses, there will be problems. The problems are not necessarily curses. There will be a lot of positive things, and it will be pleasing to God, and you can have that, and nobody else on the face of the earth can have it but us. I'll tell you why. Jesus Christ said, it is given to a very few rare human beings to understand what marriage is, His type of marriage, and to have the kind of marriage that He has blessed. He said, a very, very few receive it. And He said, if you can receive it, you better receive it. Some of us haven't received it yet. In 1981, we're surrounded by all the failures. And failure is contagious. If everyone else is failing, you think maybe I should fail too. How many people in your block are still living with their first mate? Precious few. And it gets contagious, and we see all these people around us, relations and neighbors, and even a few church members on occasion, colleagues, others, floundering around in their marriages. And we begin to say, well, maybe I should flounder too, because it seems to be the style. And it does seem to be contagious to some degree. I remember the trauma of my own parents' divorce when I was very young. I was about 6.5 when they were divorced. And I didn't understand it then. I have in later years begun to understand it. And it was a very rare thing then for a marriage to fall apart. Doesn't mean people were happily married in those days. Just means society said you had to stay together, even though you were miserable, and most people were. Well, my father was an Irishman and my mother was a Scot. And, they weren't the types that stayed together because society said you should. They went ahead and broke up and got a divorce anyway. And it had never been a good marriage. My mother was 17 when they were married, which is far too young. And my father was almost 30, which was typical of that part of the world in those days. He was too old for her and she was too young for him. And it began to deteriorate because they had so little in common. They had vast areas of incompatibility. They were not alike in anything. It would seem. I could never see any likeness between the two of them. There were financial problems, and my mother was, the type that would get very uptight about things, very security conscious, and my father was not that way at all. And they lived with my grandfather, which of course is just dramatic. When you live with your parents, God says something terrible happens after marriage. If you live with your parents, you should never do that. And I do mean something terrible. I really do. People say, well, in the Old Testament, they all lived together in a clan. Yeah, but they had a separate tent. They didn't live in the same tent. Maybe it was only half a mile away. Maybe it was the same camp. But it was a separate tent. You shouldn't live with your parents after marriage. My parents lived with my father's parents, and it was a mess, and it didn't work out, and it fell apart, as do most marriages in the world, to one degree or another, because it had nothing going for it. Now, in marriage, brethren, you face gigantic physical, mental, and emotional adjustments. The beautiful young people that we marry, they never understand that because they assume there'll be no adjustments. They're in love. I always sort of have to, I don't laugh in their face. I wait until they've gone. Then I usually cry. But anyway, there are all these vast adjustments they know nothing about. Boggle the mind. And the odds against permanent marital bliss are almost insuperable. The odds are unbelievable. Over the long haul, not the short haul, but the long haul, unless you see there's been a miracle and God has sanctified the union, because He doesn't sanctify all of them, He sanctifies very few. Unless God has renewed the two partners, unless the Spirit of God is working through the husband and the wife, and that indwelling of God's Spirit is there, which changes the marriage, and then places it on a spirit level status, and at that point, things can begin to happen, and I'll tell you, miracles begin to occur in that kind of a marriage that will occur no place else on the face of the earth, and unless that does occur, it'll never work very well. You may say, I have a friend who has a good marriage. They've been married 10 years and it's really great. Well, I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. I would just have to ask which of the two people in your friend's marriage is the martyr. There's always a martyr in a good marriage in the world. There's always a martyr. Is it him or is it her? Usually it's him. Anyway, I'll come to that in a minute. Problems arise because the marital relationship involves two human beings, obviously, with two full-blown, fully developed egos. And that, brethren, is where the problems begin. Two gigantic egos, you see, a male ego and a female ego, both seeking satisfaction and gratification and self-fulfillment, especially in this day and age, and independence and all the rest of it, you see. And within that kind of a relationship, two human beings cannot both have, total self-fulfillment and self-gratification. It won't occur. And so the two egos strive energetically, you see, to get on top of things. And then in addition, you've got all these differences, the different nature, the different personality, the different background. Very few people have been born in the same town and are exactly alike. Most people, I'll get to that later, are very, very different, in fact. Very different, very variant one from the other. And then you throw in the misunderstandings and the hassle of daily life and the pressure of kids, the pressure of jobs, the pressure of relations, heave all that into it, and you got a bucket of crabs. And it is a very, very complicated situation, to say the least. And, can these two ego-dominated human beings that say that we love each other, but you see they've been living separately, they've been living miles apart from each other, can you bring them together in the same house? And they both got carnal minds, and they both want to get what they want to get, and they want gratification on all levels for themselves. What is going to happen ultimately, brethren? Permanent bliss? Or will you finally have a clash of wills? Is it like Star Wars all over again? Just a continual clash. Until one of them finally gives in and says, you run the show, I'm tired of the fight. And then people say, what a nice marriage! Isn't that sweet? They get along so well. Yeah. Because what's his name, you see, is given in, and he lets her wear the pants. Or maybe on rare occasion, she gives in and gets tired of his fighting and lets him wear the pants. So that is generally a very tiny minority of the cases. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. When there's a fight, You know how often women win the fight? About 90% of the time. For every woman who is beaten by her husband, I mean really beaten, the battered wife syndrome, and there are a lot of those, and it's an awful thing. But for every beaten woman beaten by her husband's fists, I can point to a good 9 men who have been beaten into a bloody pulp, verbally by their wife's tongue, very frankly. And so there's two sides to the story of battered wives. There are a whole lot of battered husbands too, but it's verbal then. It's sort of futile. I look at marriage in the world and I think, well, is God behind the structure? Well, He is behind the structure. But there's something about the structure you've got to understand. It must be blessed and sanctified by God. Structure that is, husband in charge, wife is the helpmeet, kids in the family. That is not going to work unless God is involved within it, because God made the structure to work, you see, within a context that He has ordained, with the Spirit of God involved. You remove the Spirit of God, the structure doesn't work. Now, it's been said that marriage is sort of like a cafeteria, and I tend to agree. The person who said this has a certain amount of insight. He said when you first make your selection, marriage, cafeteria, everything looks so good. It always does. But, you always, at the end of it all, have to pay. You always pay, and pay, and pay, and pay, and pay. But you don't pay immediately, you see. You don't pay for a while in the cafeteria or in your marriage. But ultimately, there is a price to be paid. And sometimes the price is pretty high. My mother had 4 sisters and 2 brothers. They're all in the 60s and 70s. Now they're all elderly. They're all alive. And her eldest brother must be in his late 70s. He's about 78. And he's still married to his first wife. I lived with him for a year and watched them fight and scream and batter each other. She beat him with her tongue and he beat her with his fists. And she was a little tiny thing, but she could fight just as good as well as he could, except she fought verbally and he was a big hulk of a man, about 6'3". Now he's a shattered kind of elderly gentleman who can barely walk. And he stopped fighting with his fist, but she hasn't stopped the tongue yet. Sad. And someday she'll put him in his grave. Anyway, they're still together. I'm sure they let people say, isn't it sweet? This sweet elderly couple, been together 45 years, isn't it sweet? I lived with them for a year, and I saw what they went through to stay together. I saw it. I was not impressed. I still am not impressed by their marriage. I got another aunt and uncle. They're in their late 60s, and they're still together. And they fought for about 10 years, and he gave in very quickly. He couldn't take it. He's a little quiet, mousy guy now. And she runs the show, of course. And she'll put him in his grave within 5 years if Jesus Christ doesn't come to put an end to it all, because he's on his way. He won't last a whole lot longer. But, maybe I sound like I'm sexist and pro-male. I'm not, as you'll see in the sermon. I have a lot of things to say about men and what men should be doing in their marriages. But I can't get the ladies off the hook either, because you've done a lot of damage, women, to men. You've destroyed them. An awful lot, and a lot of men have destroyed women too. But you see, the problem is this: it is marriage that has done a lot of the destroying. It is marriage, the structure without God. The structure doesn't work all that well without God, you see. It's better than no structure. It is better than nothing. It is one cut, superior to, people just sort of living like animals, definitely. It maintains within society some stability. And I certainly am for the structure of marriage. But in the Church of God, we can have so much more. We can have the structure, but used of God, the structure then works, and works beautifully and in a wonderful way. I remember as a teenager, I decided never to get married. I'd seen too many failures, and specifically my own parents' failure. And kids will tend to have that reaction when their parents fail in their marriage, which is why you hopefully will not fail. I have 2 sisters, both of them who said, as I said, that they would never get married. And they haven't, by the way. They're both spinsters. They're not all that old or elderly yet. Maybe someday they will. But they've never gotten married because they've been burned, you see, by what they've seen around them. Well, I got married, so how did I get deburned? I mean, how did I come around to the point where I would say, well, I think I'm in favor of it after all, because I am, totally. I changed my mind because when I came into the Church of God, I found out that I had never in my entire life ever seen a couple whose marriage had been sanctified by God. When I began to see what that sanctification of a union did, the miracle of bringing 2 human beings together in their minds and hearts and personalities and characters, what cleaving together really means, because nobody in the world cleaves, brethren. That is a work of the Spirit of God. I'll show that to you in a couple of minutes. Changed my mind at that point in time. I found out that the potential of true harmony is absent from human nature. And human beings on any level cannot have harmony. I mean, within a nation, within a shop, within a plant, within marriage, kids on the school ground, there is no potential for permanent harmony within the mind of men. It simply isn't there. And therefore, you bring a man and a woman together in a marriage, there's no potential for permanent harmony. There's a potential for brief harmony, for periods of time when things go okay, and one of them will be a martyr to the cause. They can even have a half-decent union for a lot of their lives. But you've always got a martyr. You've always got someone being oppressed, because the Spirit of God has got to be there for it to work out effectively in both of them, and at least in one of them. And if it's only in one, at least there's some hope then. So I want to talk about the structure. When God ordains a marriage, it was meant to be like a triangle. A man, a woman, and God, you see. That's how it works. Headship, the man is in charge. The wife is to submit. There are to be kids, of course, if possible, if that is what God wills within certain marriages, and God. And then it works. You remove God, and you got a man and a woman and kids. And you don't have the sanctity. You don't have the Spirit of God. You don't have any miracles, and you have a situation which is not going to work all that well. It'll work a little bit. It'll sort of work from time to time. Notice Matthew 19. Jesus told that to the early apostles, and they all had a fit, as you'll see in a minute. It's interesting, and I'll begin to analyze why they had this hysterical reaction to what he said. And they almost went hysterical. Tells you a lot about their marriages, doesn't it? We'll see a little bit about Mrs. Mark and Mrs. Matthew and Mrs. John in a minute. Chapter 19 of the book of Matthew. I have a lot of respect for the early apostles. I don't have much respect for their wives because I never bumped into them and they're never named or mentioned. Why? Well, we'll see that in a minute. Verse 3, the Pharisees came unto Jesus, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Now, they said that because it had been permitted in the Old Testament, and God had regulated the system in such a way that divorce was allowed in the Old Testament amongst carnal and converted Israelites, virtually, not quite, but almost for every cause. Now, God didn't like it, and He didn't really want it to be that way at all. But He did, allow the system to be developed, and there was a certain amount of regulation of that kind of a system. And you'll see why in a minute. When Jesus, verse 4, he knew what had been allowed in the Old Testament. He answered and said unto them, Have you not read that He which made them at the beginning, we'll get back to that in a minute, to what happened at the beginning, He made them male and female, not male and females. Not males and female. Not one man and many wives, or one wife and many men. One man, one woman. That's interesting. There was no selection and no choice. I mean, he put them in a corner and said, Adam, meet Eve. And now we have the wedding. He made them male and female. That's all. And He said, verse 5, at the beginning, for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother. Now, they didn't have one, but other people after them would. And he shall cleave to his wife. That's a very, very powerful verb. It means to weld or to glue together. He shall cleave to his wife. And there's a picture of oneness and of sharing and being together. And they two shall be one flesh, brethren. That is one unit. That is one entity. And that comes through a work of the Spirit of God. And that does not apply. Understand? That does not apply to the marriage of the people that live next door to you, or the people down the block. They may have those words in their head if they got married in a Baptist church or a Lutheran church, but it is only words in their head. That came as a result of the sanctification of a marriage. Jesus said at the beginning marriages were like this, but you get into the book of Deuteronomy and they weren't. You get into David's life and it wasn't. You get back to the time of Jesus Christ and suddenly Jesus said, it is time once again for men and women in marriage to cleave to one another and to become one flesh, because they hadn't done that for thousands of years. There were no spirit plane relationships, with maybe one or two exceptions, for thousands of years. They twain will become one flesh, one unit. Wherefore there are no more twain but one flesh. Now the emphasis there is not on the physical union, though that is included, but the spirit plane union, the union of heart and mind and personality and character and all the rest of it. What therefore God has joined together, let not men put asunder. No, they said unto him, the disciples, why did Moses then command to give a writing of a divorcement and to put her away? He said you could divorce her for any reason. And Jesus said unto them, Moses did this because for a time the hearts of the people of God were hardened, because of the hardness of your heart. because they didn't have the Holy Spirit, is what he's saying. Their hearts were hard and carnal, and they weren't responsive and couldn't be to spiritual things. Therefore, because they had unconverted hearts, because the Spirit of God was neither in the husband or the wife, when the marriages took place, the Spirit of God was not there, and they, in their carnality and their selfishness, you see, joined themselves one to another, but God said there was no miracle there that came from His Spirit to bind them together, to cause them to cleave, to make them one flesh. And because they weren't one flesh, that's the point. They did not have spirit-plane marriages, because He wasn't involved. Because of the hardness of their hearts, He allowed and tolerated you when you put away your wives, plural. But from the beginning it wasn't so. You know why it wasn't so from the beginning? Because Adam and Eve were married by God and had God's blessing and had access, though they didn't, get to it, to the tree of life. And the tree of life was symbolic of the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God was with them, though it wasn't in them yet, but it was with them. And because of that, for a little while, Adam and Eve had a spirit-plane relationship. They had that potential, and God had blessed their marriage, and they had the potential of cleaving together and being one flesh. And when they hauled that marriage, brethren, off that spiritual plane, they were no longer one flesh, they were not one, they didn't cleave, they had all kinds of problems, and then for 4,000 years, God sort of put up with all of the shenanigans that went on, because He didn't have any choice. The Spirit of God was not working with men to any great degree. Now I say unto you in verse 9, now he's talking about this age. Jesus Christ has come, and He's begun to put marriage together in a different way. And there is a new design, but it's really the original design when you come right down to it, the design back in Genesis 1. I say unto you, whoever puts away his wife except to be for fornication, which is a kind of a hidden fraudulent thing when marriage takes place, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whosoever marries her that is put away, does also commit adultery. I'm not dealing here with the mixed marriage situation, the one converted and one not, and the one who's unconverted leaves. And we understand that, I'm sure, in 1 Corinthians 7. Verse 10. Notice what happened. His disciples began to get vaguely hysterical at this point. His disciples said unto Him, if the case of the man, male chauvinist pigs, you see. If the case of the man be so with his wife, if we can't put away the old lady any time we please, and they were all married men. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 5 says they were almost all married. And Matthew says that Peter had a mother-in-law, which means he had to have a wife. He said, if we can't put away our wives, it is good not to marry. And they were looking at each other sort of horrified. You know why? Well, they were astounded that a marriage was meant to be permanent. That shocked them. And the terms one flesh and cleaving together and all of that, that was so alien to their minds, because there had been no emphasis amongst the Jews on one flesh and cleaving and being together and permanency and unity and all the rest of it. That wasn't there at all, because they had carnal marriages. And, you read in the Bible about Aquila and Priscilla, don't you? And Priscilla was Aquila's wife, and they were a team in the Church of God in the early history of the church, and it said that Aquila and Priscilla were tent makers. In other words, they both made tents. She worked with him. I mean, they even shared their job was shared. They shared everything. And when they went to serve, they went together. And, 5, 8, 10 times in the Bible you read about Priscilla and Aquila, the husband and the wife, and all that they did for the Church of God. But that came later. How many times do you read about Peter's wife? What was her name? We read about, Priscilla and Aquila. No, they did a lot together. What about Peter's wife? Did she work with him? Were they together? Were they one flesh? Were Mr. and Mrs. Peter like, Priscilla and Aquila? Was Peter's wife named Judith or, Anastasia or Gertrude? I mean, what was his wife's name? You don't know. Well, why don't you know? Because Peter didn't bother to ever tell us. What does that tell you about Peter and his wife? Tells me a few things about Peter and his wife. I think she was a Grace Sparrow. I think he was either embarrassed or wasn't that fond of her, or they didn't have any great relationship left any longer. Look, Peter was in the group that listened to Jesus. Peter was there. And the disciples all got hysterical and said, hey, if we can't divorce our wife for any cause, it would have been better never to have gotten married to begin with, but they already were. Now, do you get the feeling, reading between the lines, that they weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of permanent marriage? I get that feeling. If they had a spirit-level marriage, they'd be thrilled. They'd be very happy. Wouldn't bother. They'd say great. They didn't say great. They were very upset. Anyway, verse 11, Jesus begins to talk about the work of the Spirit of God and how It's clear that the kind of marriage he was referring to was indeed very, very rare and is given to so few. Verse 12, but you can have it. He said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, neither can a lot of women, you see. All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. You see how rare it is? It must be given to you, embedded within your mind, and that is done by a work of the Spirit of God. It must be given to you, otherwise you can't accept the one flesh, one mind, one unit, one entity, the togetherness, the cleaving. It won't work, and you'll know it won't work, and you won't want it, and you won't like it, and you'll be miserable with it. But when the Spirit of God works the miracle, you see, it comes. And you can have it. It is given. And verse 12. And we'll see it's given to those who receive the Spirit of God, and it creates a miracle of bonding and blending and helping to adjust in harmony and unity. And it becomes a type then of the family of God. Once the kingdom of God is set up, it shall always be in harmony and unity. Verse 12. Then he said to those that couldn't buy this, that weren't ready for it, because some of them were. He said, there are some eunuchs. He said, some of you just need to, a couple of them, I guess, weren't married, but he was giving a general principle. Some eunuchs that were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and he said there'd be some of you that better not ever consider marriage, because unless you can sort of figure out what all this means that he had just said, it's going to be too hard for you. He that is able to receive this, let him receive it. I hope that you can receive it, brethren. I hope you have received it already. Now, if you can't, if it's hard to accept it, notice what verse 26 says. In context, going on down to this, Jesus beheld them and said unto them, with men, this is impossible. And the same thing with the marriage thing. With God, all things are possible. I want to examine the results of the spirit-plane relationship for a few minutes and show you how God creates unity and how God builds a relationship between a man and a woman, which is the goal of His. And when God is in a marriage, when there's a man and a woman and God, it can be permanent, it can be united, it will never be perfect, you see. It will never be perfect because we're not perfect, but it can be a good marriage. It can definitely be a work of the Spirit of God. Now, may I say with all love and respect that the reason, if not the main reason, why most marital discord exists in the Church of God, that reason is rooted back in personal spiritual problems. And don't come to me and say, well, look, we don't get along because of insurmountable incompatibility. The Spirit of God can give it all that. Don't even mention incompatibility to me. Well, you can mention it, but it won't have any effect. I'll just say, well, after baptism were hands laid on you? After his baptism were hands laid on him? Okay, let's not discuss the issue. People say, well, it's because of the interference of his parents. His parents just bug us, and it's not parents. The Spirit of God can get you over that hump and around the problem of parents. People talk about the pressure of kids, and they certainly are pressure, and the pressure of society and finances, but the Spirit of God can take you through pressure, you see. That's part of the work the Spirit of God does. People talk about sexual dysfunction of certain types, but the Spirit of God can lead you through that as well. And there are sexual problems that sometimes people have to deal with, but God's Spirit helps people to deal with those things. The problems occur when we take our marriage off the spiritual plane, you see, when we cause the Spirit of God through our own lacks to cease functioning in our lives. And at that point, and you can begin to sense it, two gigantic, grasping, fully developed egos, you see, suddenly reappear. And when the ego is back in charge, your marriage has one chance in a million of working really effectively. It really does. And we've got to be careful. Carnal minds create problems in marriages. Because of the hardness of your heart, he said they got divorces back then and gave up their wives. And some of you that don't get along with each other, don't get along, I'll be very frank, and don't think it's simplistic because it isn't simplistic at all. You don't get along because you are simply carnal in that aspect of your lives. And if you would let the Spirit of God begin to work through you and work through Him, it would all be released, and the problems would be in the process of being resolved. I remember watching a couple that at one time I was very close to take their marriage off the spiritual plane and began to low-key it and downgrade it and do some very stupid things. And it became ultimately, and still is, in fact, a carnal business agreement. They live together because, well, there is a marriage, but it's a business partnership now. And that is what happens to so many marriages in the world. It becomes a business partnership. Question of money, security, and where you live. I recall when they first came into the church in 1968, I believe it was, and I was very moved, brethren, by the strength of their marriage. They had a very good marriage for a worldly marriage. And as I said, there are people in the world at the beginning of their marriage without God have a half-decent situation because it's the beginning for one thing. They've only been married about 6-7 years. And they're still sort of, running on the fuel of that initial flush of romance to some degree. But always there is a martyr there. And there was in this marriage too, but let's say it was not a bad marriage in one sense for a secular, physical, plain marriage. And then God gave them His Spirit, and they both began to grow. And you could see the marriage, you see, being lifted by God because He does this onto a different level, a new dimension. The Spirit of God began to work through both of them, and they began to have a spirit-level, spirit-plane marriage. Mr. Armstrong often talks about. And it was a pleasure to see their increasing closeness in the team spirit. He became a deacon ultimately, and she worked with him. I don't think she ever was ordained as a deaconess, and yet she probably could have been because she served just as much as he did, and they served together. They were very much like, I was going to say Ananias and Sapphira. I meant, the other ones, and it just dropped out of my mind. Certainly not Ananias and Sapphira. But Priscilla and Aquila is what I'm trying to say. They built their own house together. And they did a lot of things together. They put every brick on the house. They put, the whole structure they put together, and they worked on it. It took them about 6 years. They built the house together. They loved horses. And they trained horses together. They rode together. They did so many things together for years and years and years. And their marriage grew because it became a spirit-level union. And the cleaving together, you see, the cleaving together that occurs, that is not a physical union as such. It does include that, but more a spiritual, mental, and an emotional coming together did happen, and there was a miracle there. And the one flesh unit did come into being. And then after 6 or 7 years in the Church of God and his ordination as a... And so he worked long hours, longer than he'd worked before, and he came home tired, and for a few months he didn't communicate much with his wife. Now the point is that she'd been used, you see, to sharing everything with him. She'd been used to communicating and talking every evening, and they had a lot of closeness. And suddenly, it was like she was in, third position, and the job was in number 2, and God was in number 1, and she wasn't used to that, and it was a very hard transition for her to make it, and in fact, she didn't make it. The job began to monopolize him, which was bad, and then a distortion began to take place, and I'll tell you about that distortion, because it can apply to any of us. Women were designed by God to want to share the life of a man. That is the most basic, deepest, you see, reaction. You can't go any deeper in a woman's emotional life. Because at the very bottom, at the very basis, there is an inborn need embedded there by Almighty God to want to share the life of a man. To share his dreams and his hopes and his aspirations, and to be a helpmate or a helpmeet, a help suitable to him. To assist him in constructing and building his life. And to share in his thoughts and ideas and feelings and needs. And if a man refuses, even briefly, you see, to share his life with his wife because of some obsessive or privacy need, Satan has developed a society where we males have become very private. You know why Satan has done that? To drive women crazy, to drive them out of their minds. We men have gotten very private. Don't come near me, woman. You see, I have my thoughts. And they're mine. And of course, the deepest need of a woman is to share in those thoughts. But Satan doesn't want that to happen because he wants to destroy and not build the marriage unit. So a lot of men have this obsessive privacy thing. The strong, silent type. I don't talk. Well, you'll drive her nuts. But you make the choice. Some men do it because they're indifferent. Or they're stupid. Or they punish their wife, because a man learns that one way to punish his wife, you see, when something goes wrong, is to give her the cold shoulder. Just turn off, hide behind the paper, and of course she'll go up the wall. And we've learned that, haven't we, gentlemen? You know that. Just turn off for a while, and you can just sort of see that her teeth begin to grind. You can see the look in her eyes. And she goes sort of wacky. She feels threatened at the very deepest level of her emotional life. And men know that. A woman can't tolerate exclusion from her husband's life because she was designed by God to want that involvement. And you throw her out or keep her out, something begins to happen. Well, there are 2 reactions that can occur, generally. 2 are carnal and 1 is spiritual. The first reaction of many women, and this is not the only reaction, this is one. And that is to react childishly and very carnally and very noisily and get very angry when she's left out. And get very testy and then sort of flounce around and in a continual huff. And yak and talk and nag and you never talk to me and you're never around and you never tell me anything and you never talk. And while he is shutting up, she is blabbing even louder and more testily. And of course, he's getting even more quiet, you see, because he has learned that the way to punish her is to turn off completely. And she has learned the way to punish him, you see, and to hurt herself. Masochistic reaction is to keep on yakking about it because then he says even less, which is what occurs. Very carnal reaction on both parts. Second reaction of many women is this. She may react by ignoring him, not by getting angry and yakking, but by saying nothing. That is, by doing to him what he has done to her. By turning off completely, in effect, by punishing him, by doing to him what he has, in her mind, done to her. That is, some women, this is the minority, but some women will do this, will build a barricade around their life so that he doesn't hurt her anymore by not sharing, you see. So a lot of women will hide inside this little tower, and they won't talk for a while. They're trying to hide from the hurt. And at that point they begin to seek, you see, other channels because it's essential. There has to be another channel to somehow share and reach out because the need to reach out, the need to be an asset, the need to complement, the need to help, the need to pick up where somebody else leaves off, the need to give of oneself. The need for dedication, in one sense, is very strong in a woman's life. It is a powerful emotion and it is very, very deep. And there are ways of channeling that, of course, in an effective way. An unmarried woman can find the kind of job or the kind of work where she has given herself, you know, in sacrifice and service. And she may not be sharing with one man, but she is sharing her life with humanity. And that's important and that is good for a woman who is not married. A woman who is married, though, however, you see, has a situation where she can share. Now, that is denied her, then she will seek automatically a career to channel it elsewhere. Or she will become obsessively involved in her kids' lives. Obsessively to the point, you see, that she leaves her husband out of everything, and, all the focus is on the kids, because she's going to have to share, and if she can't with him, then she'll share with them. And so she just gives herself to the kids. And then, of course, some women, especially in this age, will simply go out and find themselves another man who will let them share, and who will talk, and who will be nice, and who will open up, and who will, tell their wife what is in their head, and who will share their lives. And women will do that as well. Now, the third reaction is the biblical one. It involves God. It necessitates the Spirit of God. It is the only right reaction to have under those circumstances. And it's only available to a few who can receive it. Can you receive it? Have you received it? What you do is this, you see. You begin to pray for strength and for power and for submission. Submission is a fruit of the Spirit of God. That fruit is meekness. You begin to pray for that. And you ask for you ask God for the help to cope with your husband's temporary, non-sharing reactions, because he'll have them. Men tend to have them. Men have been designed by Satan, it seems, in this age. Conditioned. Designed by God originally, but conditioned by Satan not to want to. I'm going to show you about Adam. When Adam was created, he wanted to share everything. He really did. I'll tell you, he wrote poetry. Did you know that? Adam got eloquent when he talked to his wife. They shared everything. I'll tell you for a few days, until their marriage was pulled off the spiritual plane. A woman ought to pray and ask God for strength to adjust to her husband's silence for a while, and she'll receive it. That's the only reaction that's right. Strength not to nag, and she'll receive it. Strength not to retreat back into her shell and lick her wounds, and she'll receive it. And then you see, as she shows God that she is putting her marriage on the spiritual plane, that she's working with her marriage, that the Spirit of God is going to change her marriage, at that point she can begin to ask God the Father to work in her husband's mind and to cause the dumb clunk, you see, to see that he's leaving her out, that he's doing something very, very damaging, that's going to have a totally deleterious effect on their marriage. She can then ask God for a miracle that will be worked in his life, and God will then give that miracle, and then somehow he'll become responsive again to her needs. That didn't happen to the couple I've been talking about. After 10 years of, sharing and giving and having a good marriage, he got preoccupied with a job. Too preoccupied, and that was bad. Then his wife got naggy and hurt and crabby and began to yak about it, and he was sort of a quiet guy. So many men are. And he didn't like it. And then things began to go downhill. And, he reacted to her testiness and her nagginess about him coming home tired and not talking. He reacted to that by going back into his shell even more deeply. She, of course, then got even more naggy because, you see, she was out for bear. This was a fight. He wasn't talking, he wasn't reacting, and she got even more noisy. Then he got even more quiet, and she got more noisy, And there are times you want to run in and grab the guy and say something, and run over and grab the woman and say, would you please shut up for a while and let him talk? Because he will, if you, just button it. She didn't, and he didn't. They were both equally at fault. Such a sad thing. And they drew away from each other. And then he began to come home even later because it was so noisy at home and she was always at him. Always at him. And finally there was an affair and he began to go out with one of his colleagues at work, another woman. And I finally had to go through the gut-wrenching experience of disfellowshipping him as a result. I remember the day I asked him why the other woman had come into his life. Why did he do it? And he used words I've heard 100 times before, and I will hear them probably 100 times again. He said, when I go home to my wife, I feel under attack. He said, it's like a state of war. He said, I can't take the hassle. I'm tired of it. I go home and she is on me like a leech. He said, the other woman leaves me in peace. I go to her house. I relax. Everything's quiet. I'm at home. She leaves me alone. She only talks to me when I want to talk. Well, I could have told him, well, that'll last for a year because she's a woman too, you see. Ultimately, she'll be, trying to pick your brain as well. Anyway, I didn't tell him that. I felt sort of sad. I went back to his wife and I talked to her about her reactions and I told her that her husband felt that he was under attack and that's why he wasn't coming home. And of course a lot of it was his fault as well, obviously. And, she said to me, and she had tears in her eyes, she said, I didn't realize I was coming on as an attacker. She said, all I wanted him to do was love me and share my life. That's all she wanted, really, you see. All she wanted was to be loved and to have his life shared with her so that she could be a part of his life and fulfill her purpose. And she said, when he leaves me out, she said, I always go a little bit wacky and then I just get crabby and yacky. And she said, it's so hard to control because all I want is for him to share his life with me. But what she was doing, you see, in reacting to it, was causing the door to be closed even more tightly. I wonder if your wife has ever gone a little wacky on you like that because you haven't shared your life with her. Ever come home at, 7:30 when she expected you home at 6 o'clock? And you didn't call, and you should have, and you meant to, and you thought, well, she won't mind, and she did mind. Ever done that? And you came in the door feeling mildly guilty, and you knew you should have called, and it was already 7:45 by that time, and you felt bad about it. And you can tell, but there's a feeling in the air, and you know that you have really blown it. You have really done something you shouldn't have done, which is true. Because you left her out, you see. She didn't know what you were doing for those 2 hours. She prepared a meal that she was going to share with you. Do you see? When a woman shares with a man, something very deep and very profound is occurring. When she prepares a meal that is to be shared with you, and you reject the meal and come home 2 hours late, and she doesn't know where you've been, and you say, well, she always wants to know exactly where I am. Yeah, I buy that. I personally think she should. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what a helpmeet wants to be, you see, a share of your life. And she can't share it if she doesn't know where you are and what your life is all about. A lot of men say to me, my wife is so nosy. You know why? She probably is. That's probably because you're not telling her enough about yourself for her to be able to fulfill that need to share, so she's got to ask the questions to find out what is going on. When I first got married, I think one of the things that I found hardest to adapt to, in a sense, was, my wife's need to figure out exactly, specifically, in detail what was going on in my head. And I'd just be sitting there reading the newspaper or something of the kind, or cogitating on a church problem, and she'd look at me, I'm sort of behind the newspaper, and she'd say, What are you thinking about right now? It's sort of like a game. What are you thinking about right? I want to know the exact thought that is in your head, because I'd maybe have a quizzical look on my face, and she wanted to know what the thought was in my head. Of course, my initial carnal human reaction is, well, what's that to you? That's not a nice reaction. That's a carnal reaction, and that's the reaction of a male who doesn't understand what marriage is all about. Because you see, to a woman, that is an awful lot. Now, that doesn't mean that you have the right to go around asking your husband every 5 minutes what's going on in your head. But if every now and then you want to know, you have a perfect right to ask, and he has a responsibility to answer. He really does. Now, I'm grateful that over the years my wife hasn't attacked me, which she hasn't done. Many women do it. I have no trespassing signs to you. See, I've been raised in society. I wasn't raised in the Church of God. And in society, a man sticks these no trespassing signs all over his psyche, all over his emotional life. Don't come in here. Close the doors, lock doors that you don't get into. And of course, after marriage, every woman wants inside those doors. She wants in there. That's what she was designed to want. That's an automatic reaction. What do you do at that point? Well, I think what a husband does is learn to pull out some of those signs, and he learns to slowly open up some of those doors. It is hard because it isn't our way. It isn't it isn't the way we naturally react. That takes the Spirit of God. You begin to see what I'm talking about? That takes the Spirit of God. And then it takes the Spirit of God in a wife, you see, so that she has the control to wait until her husband can begin to share and can begin to cleave and can begin to have that need for oneness and the unit and the entity, the one entity, the one flesh that he doesn't automatically have. Of course, when a man gets married, he wants love, he wants closeness, he wants intimacy and all of that. But there is a point over which you dare not go. He thinks. And of course, you're going to try to get over that hump, over that fence. You're going to try to get through those closed. A week ago, we got a letter from the lady saying that her husband was thinking of coming back into the church after all he's done and all he's gone through. She said, finally, Bob is thinking of coming back and is thinking of tithing again. And I hope he is. I hope he does. I hope he will. And I hope when he does come back, if he comes back, that he will put his marriage back up on the spiritual plane, brethren, and leave it there and use the Spirit of God. His marriage was so beautiful when it was on that spiritual plane. It was an outstanding, wonderful, miraculous unit that is so rare. And he pulled it off. And they've had 10 years of hell, and it hasn't been pretty. I hope it's going to come back into shape. What I want to ask you today is this. Has your marriage been sanctified by God? I mean, what do you have? Do you have a spirit-level union, or do you have a carnal union, an Old Testament type, the type that Jesus talked about, you see, in the days of the Old Testament Israelites, a secular, physical kind of a setup, run by intellect, dominated by the ego, shot through and through with carnal reactions, and you tug and she tugs, and you fight and you battle, and there's this power struggle raging back and forth, and the power struggle has gone for 25 years. Now that's the kind of marriage you have. You do not have a spirit-level union. You have a carnal business relationship with certain emotional ties. But you don't have what God is talking about. Let's notice what God is talking about. Genesis 1. Here's a marriage that was ordained of God, blessed and sanctified, and then pulled off that spiritual plane by the parties involved. Genesis 1, verse 26. God said, let us make man in our image. So he did. Verse 27 in the book of Genesis. And this is the kind of thing Jesus was talking about. As it was at the beginning, how was it? God created man, verse 27, in his own image. In the image of God created he him. And he was created first to show headship. Male and female created he them. Then it began to expand out to the family. And God blessed them. I believe that was a nuptial or a marriage blessing. And it certainly follows that it was. He blessed them at that point. And God elevated their marriage onto a spiritual plane. They potentially had access to the tree of life. The Spirit of God was with them in the garden. It was blessing. It was working with their minds, not yet in their minds. They weren't yet converted in that sense. But it was there. And they were blessed. And God gave them a joint commission. Now, chapter 2, verse 18. It's a flashback just before that. And the eternal God said, before the woman was created, it's not good that the man should be alone by himself because of his incompletion. And a man alone is one half of a unit, and the full completion of a man's nature, life, personality, and everything comes within the marriage unit that has been ordained of and sanctified by God. It doesn't happen inside a secular unit at all. And maybe there's more security there, and there may be sexual satisfaction in that kind of a unit to some degree. I'm not talking about that. And anyway, you'll see in a minute that the spirit-plane relationship is a full unit. Now, there are some that have the gift of celibacy, and God obviously will give some who may never marry the compensations and the helps and all the rest of it. He certainly does. But chapter 2, verse 18 says, in a general overall way, it is not good that the man, he didn't yet discuss the woman, you see, that the man should be alone. I will therefore make an help meet for him. This is the purpose of woman. God said, I will make a help meet that is appropriate for the man because he is alone, which is not good. And that is in very condensed form the basic fulfillment described in a woman's life. It is a very, very deep thing. And she's to be a helper and to complement. I don't mean to flatter and say, I like you. To compliment, I mean add to in areas that he is lacking in. And now when I say we have to be a unit and partners and fit together, and she has to be a help meet for him that fits and works with him, that doesn't mean that we're always doing everything together. And, if you like to go skiing and she hates to go skiing, you've got to drag her up in the skiing slopes and make her absolutely miserable. Go up there with her brother-in-law who likes skiing. On the other hand, if you do go up there with your brother-in-law or somebody else and you leave the little lady at home, you need to express the fact to her that you're leaving her at home not because you don't like her, it's because she doesn't like to go skiing and she always gets queasy and, at high altitudes or something of the kind. It's for her own good. Reassure your wife so she can see that you're going off with somebody else, be it her own brother, you see, is not a rejection of her. Well, it doesn't mean you always have to be together. The interesting thing is, and I'll talk about this in a minute based on verse 18, sometimes it is the differences in our lives, in personality and nature, that enable us to function the best as a unit and to do the most for God, because we can use our divergent talents and our different abilities, you see, not just to duplicate and do the same things for having identical talents, but because our talents are often different, we can complement and complete each other and excel where the other doesn't excel, and then we become even more effective as a unit together. Now, it is an axiom that instinctively opposites do attract. Now, the reason you see God made woman is different from a man, not because she is like the man, and God put within her very being the need to tie her life to another human being that is different from her, and vice versa. But it is especially powerful in a woman's life, even more so than in a man's life. She will seek a man who is her opposite. And a man will do that to some degree as well. Because the need, you see, to complement and to complete is very strong. So that, she knows she has weaknesses, and she wants her weaknesses compensated for and diminished through blending with his corresponding strengths. But she also knows that he has weaknesses. And she knows that her strengths can somehow complement and make up for some of his weaknesses, and together they can do so much more. That's why you find that very quiet, passive, organized little ladies will tend to marry boisterous, outgoing, noisy, off-the-wall guys. And you think, boy, how come she married him? They're so different. That's why she married him, because he is so different. That was the point. Because she has a need, being very quiet, maybe rather passive and somewhat timid, she has a need to find a man who's noisy and boisterous so she can sort of mellow him a little bit and at the same time sort of spark herself up a little bit, you see. And the need of finding somebody, we admire people who are strong in areas in which we're weak, because we all have inferiority complexes. So you admire people who are strong where you're not strong almost automatically. And initially that is a good attraction. It becomes a point of conflict once you're married, because then you begin to look down on those things. Quiet men do tend to marry noisy women. Have you ever noticed that? So the little quiet guys will always have this, boisterous, outgoing, yucky wife. On the other hand, these little quiet, passive ladies who never say a thing, they always marry these guys that are, 3 times as big as they are, that laugh 10 times as loud. It's sort of interesting. When I was a minister, and I won't tell you where because you could figure out whom I'm talking about, I had an assistant sent out to assist me about 18 years ago. And this guy is 6'3". He is a bear of a man. Gigantic man. Not heavy, just big. And he had this little, quiet, clinging vine, shy little new wife that had been married 4 days when they arrived. And they lived in my house for about 2 weeks. And all she did was cry for 2 weeks. She cried. He was already ordained. Cried and cried because he was so gruff. And, he would tell her, it's time to pray. She'd rush off into the bedroom to pray. And I tried to tell him, don't set her schedule. Let her pray when she wants to pray. Well, I'm her husband and I've decided. No, boy. I thought, I'll give them 3 months, you see. This couple will never work. I didn't understand at that point in time about opposites. He's been one of our most effective ministers, and she's been one of our most effective ministers' wife. The miracle hadn't occurred in those first 2 weeks, by the way. They weren't adjusting and blending and cleaving and becoming one flesh. They were just clashing and finding out how different each other were and seeing the need of that miracle to take place, because it doesn't happen automatically. It happens when you ask for it and want it and need it and seek it. And, she is still sort of quiet, but she's not quite as quiet as she was 18 years ago. She has learned to say her a little bit. And he doesn't even look quite as big anymore. It's sort of funny. He's sort of shriveled a little bit. And there's been a combining, there has been something that has occurred there, and I think there's something out about that marriage. I would have given it 3 months, and it's lasted 18 years, and it is a good marriage. It is the blending of two divergent personalities, you see, that creates, on occasion, the strongest, most effective, and most powerful unions, because you've got so much more going for you. You don't duplicate effort all that much. You add. But only the Spirit of God can create the miracle that binds people together, so you don't clash, but you blend. You see, there's a big difference between clashing and blending. Blending comes because the Spirit of God makes you blend like this. Clashing comes, you see, because your egos prevent the Spirit of God from creating that miracle. First thing that charmed me about my wife when I first met her, which was now almost 25 years ago, and that's a long time ago, was the fact that she had an outgoing personality, and I, of course, was a bashful, shy kid who turned beet red anytime any member of the opposite sex even looked like they might even know that I was alive. I wanted them to know I was alive 25 years ago, but when I really realized that they didn't know I was alive, then it was very hard to cope with. And she talked to everybody, and I liked that, you see. She could do something at that point in my life I couldn't do. That is, talk easily to people without turning beet red. I remember I was sort of hurt because about 4 days before we were married, one of her friends rushed up to her, and about 4 days before we got married. And Bert and I, hey, you're not going to marry Carn Catherwood, are you? It won't work. He's not like you and all. He's stuffy, she said. He's stuffy. Well, she was sort of right, but I'm not quite as stuffy now as I was then, mind you. We were very different in certain ways, but very like in some ways, but there were a lot of differences there too. My wife had a very structured background, a strong father image, and a family that had a budget, and her father always worked, had jobs, had a certain amount of the right kind of pride, counted their pennies, organized their life. Now, I was raised in the slums, in the country, then in the slums, where, money trickled into our house and the neighbors' houses in very small amounts because nobody worked all that hard or all that often, and it sort of, oozed back out in the streams of vile-smelling booze. And every third house was what we called a bootlegger's house or a blind pig. The blind pig is, it's sort of an illegal place, and the whole neighborhood was full of things like that. It was not what you'd call the nice neighborhood of town. None of my relations had a budget. Most of my relations didn't necessarily hold jobs. They would go off and work in what we called the bush. For a couple of months, they'd work in the bush, make $1,000, come home, drink themselves into a stupor for 3 months, sober up, and go back in the bush for a month. And they move back and forth. The bush, the stupor, the bush, the stupor. I didn't know people had regular jobs necessarily. I knew that some people in the movies did, but I hadn't seen too many people in actual life that did. So when I came into the Church of God as a young teenager, I was easy come, easy go, very easy go, frankly. When it came to money, I was not, I didn't have any hang-ups in a sense about, getting a bill paid on time. I paid my bills, but I was always a month late. When I married my wife, subconsciously, we never discussed bills, but I knew subconsciously that she would love budgets and enjoy going through bills with a fine-tooth comb and analyzing them. And when they would come in the mail, I knew that she would get very excited and open them immediately and look and see and look at the bank book. And, her eyes light up and she sees ledgers and bank statements. She enjoys those things. And she'll deny that if you ask her and say, well, do you really? But she does, She really does enjoy them. Anyway, that could have been a conflict because in our early marriage, you see, I didn't enjoy those things and she did. And that could have become a clash. It became a blend. It didn't become a clash. I oversee the budget, but she does the details. I'm not embarrassed by that. She enjoys doing the details. She's good at them. And it's a joint effort we work together on. When we went to Belgium and we ran the office there for a year, almost a year. Let's see, we worked as a team because we had to. The work could not afford to hire another employee, and we needed another employee to do it. So I did the ministerial side of things in the office, and I did a lot of the banking as well. It's going to the bank and that type of thing. But she did the books, and she did the filing. I did the visiting, and I did the reading of the mail, and I drew up and created a lot of the ads that were placed in various newspapers and things like that. I did the ministerial things. But she ran the files, and she did the receptionist job, and did the books, and she enjoyed doing the books very, very much. I know she did. Now, I hate filing cabinets. At home, I have a filing cabinet in my office. It's the most, I don't even like to look at it. It's sort of a sick-looking pea green color. And filing cabinets are things my wife enjoys. as the week goes on at my desk at home, things began to mount up, piles of letters and different things. And I know where it all is. She doesn't believe that, but I do know where everything is, you see. I know exactly where it is. So once a week, and I'm not bothered by this, she comes in and files all that away. And I come home and it looks so nice. My desk is clear. I have no idea where anything is, but I ask, and she tells me. And I'm not bugged because she likes to put things in file cabinets, and she's not bugged because I don't like to put things in file cabinets, you see. We have blended on that. We haven't clashed. She doesn't criticize me on that. I don't feel under attack. And yet there are marriages that are broken up specifically because of things of that type. People begin to attack each other without the Spirit of God. That automatically does seem to begin to happen. Now, my wife has been an important part of my life. I don't view my wife as only the mother of my children, as some of you may do. That's a temporary job and an important one. But that is not her main job in life. I do not view my wife, you see, as a professional dishwasher or a domestic. Because I could hire a lady to come in and clean the floors and, wash the dishes and do things of that type. That, in my mind, is not a major job for my wife at all. Her major job in my heart and my mind, and this has been the case now for 19 years, is to be a helpmeet to me. And she always has been, and I appreciate that very, very much. Now, I've been moved by that because my reaction is, why would she want to somehow be a helpmate to me, But she does. And it's hard for me to understand it because I don't think I would want to be a helpmate to me. But, if she wants to be, then, I feel very blessed because it's a kind of a dedication. And it's something that I'm very moved by. Now, I don't want to gild the lily. There were times in early marriage, of course, when there were some clashes, when we didn't blend, when we didn't understand certain things about marriage and how important marriage is. And the miracle does not take place automatically or immediately. It is a work. And you'll clash before you begin to blend and work together, admittedly. But if all you've ever done, brethren, is clash, if you have clashed, head on now for 10 years, something is deeply wrong at the very deepest level of your marriage. Wrong with her and wrong with you. And you've got to change it. Now when you do, there is peace that comes and renewal that comes and some wonderful things. And, that oneness is a very precious thing. I know people have resented that. It was never resented before, but I found after I came back to the USA 3 years ago, there are people that have resented the fact that my wife is my helpmate. I have been told, in fact, by people, well, why doesn't she just go and be the mother of your children, When you're there, she's not too far behind. And that's true. And we've talked about it. I won't go into details. Her and I together have talked about it, the fact that there are brethren that very visibly resent the fact that we have a unit, that we do things together, and it bothers people in the USA because, I don't know, it just seems to. And I'm not going to let brethren break up that unit because it bothers some of our brethren. I simply will not allow that to be the case. That's not my problem, that is yours. Notice it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make in verse 18 an help meet or effective or suitable for him. And he did. And notice Adam's reaction is incredible, I think. You go on down verse 21. It began to happen. God caused a deep sleep to come upon Adam, and he slept. He took a rib out of his side, a literal rib, and closed up the side, and took that rib, verse 22. He took it from the man, he made a woman, and he put that rib in her body. To symbolize unity, you see. To symbolize a miraculous coming together of heart, soul, being, body, mind, all of it, that cannot happen unless God is involved, and he was there. And they merged their lives. Sadly, it only lasted a few days. But Jesus said, as it was at the beginning, so shall it now again be. The rib came into her body. And she was brought to the man, and Adam said, verse 23, he didn't say, finally, someone's going to be able to do my dirty laundry. He didn't say that. Adam said, notice he got poetical. This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called womb man, because she was taken out of man. Brethren, he got ecstatic, he got happy, he waxed eloquent, and he talked about unity and bone of my... this is pretty stuff. It's poetic. He didn't say, this isn't the strong, silent type emoting about the little lady. Oh, here she is, yes. he looked at her, and the first thing Eve heard from her husband, was all this poetic, ecstatic, romantic, warm, loving stuff. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He knew what was involved because the Father had told him what marriage was all about. The Father had zeroed in on the core of it. And so Adam, when he saw his wife, said somehow he knew because he had been told, that they were going to have a relationship that would be unique and wonderful, and they did, I guess, for about a week. Sad, it could have kept on. It didn't have to stop. Therefore, verse 24, and he'd been told this by the Father too, so he was repeating some things. He was just going on and on and on in this sort of speech he was giving to her in honor of her. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother. He's saying this, and she's standing right there saying, I don't have a father and a mother. She didn't know that he had been, in a sense, coached and everything to say these things. And shall cleave unto his wife. Again, the powerful verb, the blending and the coming together. And the man is the one, however, that does the cleaving. That is, the wife will automatically want to cleave. The husband must be more the active agent. So cleave unto his wife, cleave, and they shall be one flesh, as Jesus said. And notice, now one flesh means the physical union, a sexual union, of course, but it means much more a new entity coming together. And there's a blending that is being described. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, why add that detail? Was that added to sort of spice things up? Not at all, brethren. It was added, you see, to illustrate closeness and warmth and candor and unity and oneness and intimacy, which is, intimacy in the general overall sense, the goal of a true marriage. That is why that was added, to show the closeness. Chapter 3. Well, you know what happened after that? They got involved with Satan. They rebelled. They broke the laws of God. Adam followed with his wife in that rebellion. They lost their contact with God. And brethren, what happened when they began to hide from God? They got away from God. As they got away from God, their marriage began to go downhill, and they began to haul that union off that spiritual plane, and it was no longer a cleaving together, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh kind of union. It couldn't be. And we've all realized that Adam and Eve disrupted their relationship with God through sinning. But did you know they disrupted their relationship with each other through sinning? And when you sin, when you get carnal, you disrupt your relationship with God. You can't pray as well. In the book of Peter, we'll read that in a couple of weeks. It says your prayers are hindered when something goes wrong with your marriage. It's tied together. Now, you read on through this, you'll see how they lost the blessing that God had put upon their marriage. And there was a distortion that occurred. Chapter 3, verse 8, they were walking in the garden. They heard the voice of God, and they hid themselves. Verse 9, God called unto Adam and said, where are you? And Adam said in verse 10, I heard your voice, and I was afraid, because I was naked. Now again, is that added to spice things up? You see, he was afraid. He had had a close relationship with his wife. He had had a close relationship with God. Suddenly that relationship was destroyed by sin. Suddenly, you see, he felt cut off from God and cut off from his wife. The intimacy and the oneness and the closeness was really gone. The cleaving together in the heart and mind was gone. With man, with his wife, and with God. And then the nakedness, you see, that state that he had been in began to seem somehow obscene and upsetting, and he couldn't cope with it, neither before God or his wife. And he hid himself, and he said, who told you that you were naked? And they began to talk about sin. And the man said, the woman that you gave me, she caused me to eat of the tree. And the woman said, the devil caused me to eat. And then God cursed the devil, verse 15, and said, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, verse 16. Now unto the woman, he began to talk about her marriage. They had this wonderful union for a couple of weeks, as it was at the beginning, you see, as it was at the beginning. And then God said, it's going to change now. I will greatly multiply your sorrow as a woman. Now, in every marriage there is sorrow. There's no perfect marriage. We all have our problems and hassles, obviously. This isn't talking about that. This is describing an intensifying of the problems, a removal of a lot of the blessings within marriage. I will multiply your sorrow and your conception. In multiplied, intensified sorrow shall you bring forth children. And in a new way, your desire shall be to your husband, and he shall rule over you. It doesn't say you'll be one flesh. It just says he'll rule, you'll look to him, and you'll have sorrow. And that's all. Now you see, the structure was to be maintained in the marriage, God said, basically has over the centuries in the physical kind of human secular marriage. Husband, wife looking to him, the need to look to him is still in her. The need to rule is still in the man. But that's all they had. Now, those are not wrong things within a spirit plane, spirit level marriage, you see. But outside of that kind of a context, it begins to create problems. A man who is limited by not having the Spirit of God, when he rules, will tend to rule as a brute. It'll become obsessive. He will hurt his wife. He will not rule her lovingly. And the woman, as she looks to her husband, her desire is to him, you see. Without the Spirit of God, she'll have a hard time channeling it. She'll feel frustrated. She won't always submit properly. She'll want to, maybe. She'll feel guilty. There'll be this sense of uneasiness within her. The structure stayed. But the Spirit of God and the blessing of God was gone. Man, woman, God no longer. A man and a woman, you see. Everything, all the sorrow and the hassle multiplied, God said. And it has been over the centuries. You go back into ancient Israel, what did they have in their marriages? Sorrow and problems. What did David get out of his marriages, brethren? You know how many women David married trying to find a soulmate? You've heard the expression before, my soulmate. You know, we all want one. He kept marrying women one after the other. He tried Abigail, he tried this one. It didn't work. Now, he had the Spirit of God, but his wives didn't. Yet he didn't know how to somehow use the Spirit of God. And of course, if your mate isn't converted, you can still have maybe not a full spirit plane relationship, but you can have some of God's blessings in the marriage to some degree. David never had that. Maybe Sarah and Abraham both had the Spirit of God. I think they did. And in all of the Old Testament, the only decent marriage, if you want to call it a decent marriage, that you can read about is that of Abraham and of Sarah, because both of them had the Spirit of God. And very briefly, you can sort of sense that God had taken their marriage, and it was, at least for a while, on the spiritual plane, and was blessed with God. But it's about the only one. And you can read, Jacob had two women, and he married first the one he didn't want, and he married the one that he did want, and he worked for years. And what a lot of hassle. What a lot of hassle. It wasn't happy at all. It was just a structure. A husband in charge. Yeah. He ruled. Her desire was to him. He became a brute. He took advantage of her, or he tried to love her, or she took advantage of him, and there was always hassle. And then Jesus Christ came and said, to those who can receive it, I'm going to give something new. Now, do you have a Genesis chapter 2, verse 23 kind of a marriage, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, with the structure, of course, involved? Or do you have a Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 kind of a marriage with all the problems multiplied and intensified 10 times over on beyond what they should be? Let's see. We've got to close in a minute. I want to show you something in Malachi 2. It takes the Spirit of God. Malachi 2, we read it before, we'll read it again. Malachi 2, verse 14. God is prophetically talking about the church of God in the end of the age, now, and talking about our marriages. Yet you say in verse 14 of Malachi 2, why? Why all the problems? Because God has been witnesses between you and the wife of your youth. You see, He's analyzed our marriages sometimes, against whom we have dealt treacherously on occasion. We've not been loving and giving and sacrificial. And yet she is your companion. Now that goes back to Genesis 1 and Matthew 19. A companion, the wife of your covenant. Did not God make one? Yet had He the residue of the Spirit. It does take the Spirit of God. Wherefore, one. Well, one reason is to seek to have godly children, godly seed, children that are stable and happy. I don't have time to go into all that a spirit-level marriage pictures. A physical marriage doesn't picture anything. It's just a unit, you see. It doesn't picture anything that is good or eternal. But a spirit-level marriage does. It is a builder of character, for one thing. But it is also a type of every relationship in the kingdom of God that God the Father says is important. It's a type of all those wonderful relationships between the church and Christ and the Father, once we're born of God. And the one unit in life, the one relationship that can teach you more about eternity and salvation is the spirit-level marriage unit. That is why it is so precious and so important. And then another reason mentioned here is that as children are born into that kind of marriage and are sanctified by it, and are sanctified and set aside as well, there's a nurturing and a stability there that goes on that's very, very important. I read a survey a couple of weeks ago that a couple thousand kids had been asked to be a part of in the East, and teenagers. And they've been asked, if you could change your folks, what are the main things you would change in your folks' life? And they gave them about 50 things that they could, grade in importance, in order of importance. You know what came out number one? Number one was, if they could change their folks, what would they change? Number one was, I would stop them fighting with each other. You know why the kid said that? Because there's something very deep in the child that makes him want to have two parents that are one flesh, you see. One flesh produces a godly seed. And the number 5 Number 5, I won't tell you number 2, 3, and 4, but number 5 on the list of about 50 was that my parents would become better companions to each other. You didn't think kids would worry about that, but they do, you see. They really do. What the kids are saying is, I wish my parents had a God-plane, a Spirit-plane, sanctified, blessed marriage set aside by God. That's what kids deeply want. Ephesians 5 will close on this. Now, this is a foundation for some other sermons on husbands and wives and the problems we have, but I had to lay a foundation first. If you don't have a marriage that has been sanctified by God, I can give you points all day long on what a husband does and what a wife does, and you're out here doing everything husbands do and wives do, and it all blows up in your face. Because the Spirit of God is not enabling you to do, you see, what a husband and a wife must do. Ephesians 5 continually talks, the whole chapter talks about a miracle, the Spirit of God, and what it does in our life. And you can go through the whole chapter, going on to verse 18. Don't be drunk with wine where is excess. And now there's a contrast here, but do on the other hand, don't overdrink, but do, be filled to the point where your whole life is affected by the working of the Spirit of God. Now what does the Spirit of God do in your life? It does many things. It has many fruits. It mentions 3 specifically here and leads into the hierarchy of the husband and the wife, and the wife submitting, the husband being in charge. And we'll see something that has to do with the Spirit of God. There is a miracle that must occur in your marriage and in your life. Be filled with the Spirit. It does what? 3 specific things mentioned here. 1, verse 19, speaking. That's a result, a consequence of verse 18. To yourselves in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing, making melody in your heart to God. That is, it'll create a worshipful kind of a reaction within you toward God. And you'll want to serve God with greater worship. Verse 20, it'll create a spirit of thankfulness, giving thanks always, giving. That's the result of verse 18 again. The filling with the Spirit of God, giving thanks is a result. And you give thanks to the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. In verse 21, the filling of God's Spirit gives you the power and the fruit, the fruit of meekness as an example, and therefore you're able, you see, to do this, submitting, again, yourselves one to another. That's the whole body of Christ, all of us as brethren, submitting to each other, blending, not clashing. This is the whole thing about unity, you see. Without the Spirit of God, we clash because we're different as members in the body. With the Spirit of God, we're able to submit, to blend, to come together, to work as one overall collective unit, and that comes through the work of the Spirit of God, and we can then submit, you see. This is relationship in verse 21, not hierarchy yet. Now verse 22 is hierarchy. But in the light of the preceding verses, when God says, wives, submit now yourself to your own husbands, it all begins to fall into place. The reason some of you ladies can't submit, have fought, have tried, have wept, and have cried, is because you haven't asked God to put the fruit of meekness within your life, and that power is not yet there. It can come. It can't just come from you, you see. It's got to come from God. By that miracle, you can submit yourself unto your own husbands. Tie it back into verse 18, as unto the Lord. That's a heavy, heavy responsibility. It can come, though, spiritually. For the husband is the head of the wife. And verse 24 is the church is subject unto Christ. The wives must be to their own husbands in all things. You see how it can be done now. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, the Bible says. But, what kind of love is that? Is that passionate love? Not at all. Husbands, love your wives even as Christ. Here's how. Love the church. We can sanctify our wives and we can sanctify our marriages. And God can bless them. And He wants to present, of course, not just the church, but our marriages to Him with no spot or wrinkle or any such thing. They can be holy as well, verse 27, without blemish. Verse 31, for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother. Why? Well, so that verse 18 and that miracle can occur in his life. And he shall be joined unto his wife. There'll be one flesh, but it takes the working of the Spirit of God. We've got something so very rare in our lives, something unique. This is a great mystery, it certainly is. But I speak about Christ and the Church of God. Our families are types of the plan of God, and that's why it can work, and it does work, and it can be permanent. Nonetheless, verse 33, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as he loves himself. That takes a miracle. And the wife, see that she reverence her husband, that also takes a miracle. Now, I want to talk more about each responsibility in future sermons along this line, but I had to lay a foundation. There's no point in telling you what a wife does or what a husband does unless you understand what a marriage is. A marriage before God. If you can receive it, brethren, please receive it. It'll change your life. And if you haven't received it yet, I'll just say this. If you're a man, I would kneel down before God sometime this week, and I would ask God to begin to sanctify and to work in your marriage. If I was a woman, I would do the exact same thing. I would ask for that blessing and that working. At that point, you see, once the Spirit of God begins to work through you and the marriage, and all the rest of it, the rest of Ephesians 5 can begin to fall into place, and you can have something so wonderful that, it can't even begin to be imagined. Whether you're different or whether you're not different, that's something that the Spirit of God can continue to work with. So please understand how great marriage is. Marriage ordained of God and sanctified by God.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.